Start with our golden macaroni made from special durum wheat.
My cats prefer these little cans. They're meatier.
Always after me Lucky Charms, the frosted oat cereal with sweet surprises.
If your grocery cart looked like a survival experiment and your pantry smelled like cardboard and shame, welcome to the club. These weren't gourmet choices. They were what kept families fed when paychecks ran thin and pride took a back seat to survival. From government cheese that could double as a doorstop to mystery meat that defied all known laws of nature, these 25 grocery items lived in every struggling household across America. They tasted like compromise, looked like desperation, but somehow they kept us alive. And if you remember stirring oil into peanut butter until your arm went numb, you're about to take a trip down memory lane that's equal parts hilarious and heartbreaking. Powdered milk in a box. That blue and white cardboard box sat in your pantry like a monument to making do. You'd shake it, hear that dusty rattle inside, and know you were about to create something that barely qualified as milk. The powder clung to everything, the measuring cup, your fingers, the inside of the pitcher, where it formed those stubborn clumps that refused to dissolve no matter how hard you stirred. This wasn't just a grocery item. It was a badge of poverty that every kid recognized. Real milk came in glass bottles or cartons. This came in a box with instructions that might as well have read, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here." Your mom would mix it with tap water that tasted like chlorine, creating a pale, chalky liquid that coated your tongue with disappointment. You remember that first sip, how it hit your taste buds like punishment for being born into the wrong tax bracket. It was bitter, thin, and somehow both watery and gritty at the same time. But you drank it anyway because cereal wasn't optional, and neither was surviving on whatever the grocery budget allowed. The real tragedy? After a few months, you actually got used to it. Your palate surrendered to the inevitable, and suddenly powdered milk became normal. That's when you knew you'd crossed a line you couldn't uncross. Government cheese block, that orange brick, arrived in your kitchen like a geometric mystery wrapped in plastic. 5 pounds of processed cheese product that looked like it was carved from a traffic cone and had the texture of industrial foam. It didn't melt so much as it softened into rubber, and slicing it required the same concentration as diffusing a bomb. This wasn't cheese. It was survival rations disguised as dairy. The government handed it out with the confidence of someone who'd never actually tried to eat it, and families accepted it with the gratitude of people who understood that free calories were still calories. It came with no instructions, no expiration date, and no shame. You remember your mom staring at it that first day, turning it over in her hands like she was examining alien technology. How do you serve 5 pounds of orange concrete to a family of 6? The answer, very creatively and over several months, melted into mac and cheese that glowed like radioactive waste. But here's the thing, it lasted forever. That block could survive a nuclear winter and probably taste exactly the same.
And lots of Skippy peanut butter. The kids love a real peanut taste, so for us, it has to be Skippy.
No-name peanut butter with oil on top. The jar sat there like a science experiment gone wrong. Solid peanut paste at the bottom, a layer of oil floating on top like a golden moat of despair. This wasn't the smooth, creamy spread you saw in commercials. This was what happened when peanuts got processed by people who'd clearly never eaten peanut butter themselves. Stirring it was a workout routine nobody asked for. You'd plunge that knife in and start mixing, watching the oil disappear and reappear in swirls that defied physics. Your arm would cramp, your wrist would ache, and halfway through you'd question every life choice that led you to this moment. But you kept stirring because giving up meant eating oil soup with peanut chunks. The texture was never quite right, either too runny from leftover oil or too thick from overcompensating. Canned ham with a key on the lid. That little key attached to the can was supposed to make opening it elegant, like you were unwrapping a gift instead of releasing what looked like pink rubber compressed into the shape of meat. The key would break halfway through, leaving you with jagged metal edges and a ham that looked like it had been through a blender accident. This wasn't ham in any traditional sense. It was ham-adjacent, ham-inspired, ham-curious at best. It had the color of Pepto-Bismol and the texture of a stress ball that had been left in a hot car. When you sliced it, it made a sound like cutting through thick rubber, and it held its shape with the determination of something that refused to admit it wasn't real meat. But dinner was dinner, and this pink mystery fed a family when the grocery budget couldn't stretch to actual ham. Beef tongue in a can, the label didn't lie, it actually looked like a tongue, complete with taste buds and that unsettling pink color that made you question everything you thought you knew about dinner. Your mom would open that can with the same expression surgeons probably wear during particularly difficult operations, and the smell that emerged was complex. It's nutritious, she'd say, which was Depression-era code for "we're eating this whether you like it or not." And honestly, it wasn't terrible. It was weird, chewy, and had a texture that made you think too hard about what you were eating. But it was protein when protein was precious. You remember the first bite, how your brain had to override every instinct that screamed, "this is wrong," to actually chew and swallow. Powdered mashed potatoes in foil pouches. Those silver pouches promised the comfort of mashed potatoes with none of the work. Just add water and stir. What they delivered was a paste that had never seen an actual potato and didn't seem particularly interested in pretending it had. The powder would puff up in clouds when you opened the package, coating your kitchen in what looked like artificial snow. The instructions were simple. Boil water, add powder, stir. What they didn't mention was that the resulting mixture would have the texture of wallpaper paste and the flavor of sadness. No amount of butter or salt could hide the fact that these potatoes had been assembled in a laboratory by people who'd apparently never eaten real food, but they were filling, and filling was what mattered when you had 4 kids and a grocery budget that barely covered the basics. Your mom would doctor them up with whatever was available.
Have your Kellogg's cornflakes this morning. These flakes made you big and strong, right?
Right.
Right.
Store-brand cornflakes in a giant bag. Forget the colorful boxes with cartoon mascots. Your cereal came in a clear plastic bag that looked like animal feed. These cornflakes had no personality, no marketing budget, and no shame about their generic existence. They were corn that had been flattened into submission and sold at a price that made breakfast possible for families counting every penny. The bag was impossible to pour from without creating a cornflake avalanche across your kitchen counter. There was no zipper, no convenient spout, just a twist tie that never stayed twisted and flakes that went stale approximately 30 seconds after opening. But you ate them anyway because cereal was cereal. And hunger didn't care about packaging. They had no flavor beyond vaguely corn-like, and went soggy the moment milk made contact. By the time you'd eaten half a bowl, the remaining flakes had achieved the consistency of wet paper towels. Mystery meat logs, liverwurst or Braunschweiger. That pink tube of processed meat product sat in your refrigerator like a question mark wrapped in plastic. It looked like pink putty, smelled like someone's misguided attempt at European cuisine, and spread with the enthusiasm of something that had given up on life. The label might have said Leberwurst, but your taste buds said survival food. Spreading it on white bread required the same technique as spackling a wall. You'd scrape it across the surface, leaving pale pink streaks that never quite looked appetizing. It had the texture of soft clay and a flavor that was somehow both bland and aggressively weird at the same time. But it was protein, it was cheap, and it made sandwiches when lunch meat was beyond the family budget. Canned ravioli with 5 meatballs. Total. You counted them every single time. 5 little spheres of mystery meat floating in a sea of pasta pillows and sauce that looked like it had been mixed with food coloring. Not 6 meatballs, never 4, always exactly 5, like someone at the factory had a quota to meet and a calculator to help them meet it. Those meatballs were dense little nuggets that had the texture of compressed sawdust and a flavor that suggested they'd been made from whatever meat-adjacent materials were available that day. They'd break apart when you bit them, revealing an interior that was somehow both mushy and gritty at the same time. The ravioli themselves were soft pouches of pasta filled with what the label optimistically called cheese filling, but what tasted more like slightly flavored paste. They'd fall apart if you looked at them wrong, turning your bowl into a lumpy orange soup with pasta fragments floating like tiny life rafts. TVP chunks, textured vegetable protein. The package promised meat-like texture and flavor, which should have been your first warning sign. These beige chunks looked like dog kibble for humans, and had about as much flavor as cardboard that had been left in the rain. TVP was what happened when food scientists tried to create meat in a laboratory and forgot to add anything resembling taste. Your mom would rehydrate them in broth, hoping to coax some flavor into these protein pellets that looked like they'd been designed by someone who'd heard about meat but never actually eaten it. They'd absorb liquid like tiny sponges, swelling up into chunks that maintained their suspicious beige color no matter what you did to them. The texture was the real nightmare, chewy, but not in a good way, with a mouthfeel that made you think of rubber erasers that had been soaked in water. They didn't fool anyone, including the family dog, who would sniff his bowl and give you a look that said, "Really? This is what we're calling dinner." But protein was protein, and when hamburger was too expensive for the weekly grocery run, TVP chunks became the star of casseroles, chili, and whatever other dishes could hide their obvious fakeness behind enough seasoning and wishful thinking. Jell-O with shredded carrots. Inside someone somewhere decided that Jell-O needed vegetables, creating a dessert that confused every taste bud in your mouth. Orange Jell-O with bright orange carrots floating inside like tiny prison bars, creating a dish that nobody was quite sure how to categorize. Was it salad? Dessert? A punishment for some forgotten childhood crime? The carrots would float in suspension like specimens in a science experiment, maintaining their crunch even after hours of being imprisoned in gelatin. Each bite was a surprise. Would you get sweet, wobbly Jell-O or a sudden crunch of vegetable that had no business being there? Your grandmother would serve it at family dinners with the confidence of someone who'd lived through the Depression and knew that waste was a sin. She'd put it right there next to the mashed potatoes and ham, daring anyone to question her menu choices. It was colorful, it was filling, and it used up vegetables that might otherwise go bad. The real mystery was how something so wrong could become so normal. After a few family gatherings, you'd actually find yourself expecting that weird carrot crunch in your Jell-O, and regular Jell-O would seem almost boring by comparison. Milk in a plastic bag. That floppy, translucent bag of milk sat in your refrigerator like a water balloon waiting for disaster. It had no structural integrity, no dignity, and absolutely no ability to stand upright without support. Pouring it required the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a monk, because one wrong move would send milk cascading across your kitchen counter. The bag would develop mysterious leaks at the worst possible moments, usually when you were already running late for school and needed cereal. You'd grab it from the fridge, feel that telltale dampness, and know you were about to start your day cleaning up milk puddles while your breakfast plans crumbled around you. But it was cheap milk, and cheap was what mattered when every grocery dollar had to stretch until it screamed. Your mom would buy it in bulk, storing multiple bags in the refrigerator like translucent landmines, waiting to explode and cover everything in dairy products. The trick was learning to support it properly, one hand underneath, one hand controlling the pour, and a prayer that the plastic wouldn't choose that exact moment to give up on life. It was like performing minor surgery every time you wanted a glass of milk.
You know, I think sometimes people forget how good macaroni and cheese can be.
Off-brand macaroni and cheese that glowed orange. That neon powder packet looked like it had been mixed by someone who'd never actually seen cheese, but had heard a detailed description from a colorblind person. When you stirred it into the cooked macaroni, it created a shade of orange that didn't exist in nature, somewhere between traffic cone and radioactive sunset. The powder would clump together in stubborn little nuggets that refused to dissolve, no matter how vigorously you stirred. Your finished mac and cheese would have these bright orange dots scattered throughout like tiny suns in a beige pasta galaxy, each one delivering a concentrated burst of artificial cheese flavor that made your tongue tingle in ways that probably weren't entirely healthy.
A can of Chef Boyardee not only costs up to 13 cents less, it has more than 5 times more meat than any meat-flavored sauce in a jar.
Canned spaghetti with hot dogs. Inside, someone at the canning factory looked at spaghetti, looked at hot dogs, and thought these two things belong together in a can with sauce that tastes like ketchup's disappointed cousin. The result was a culinary confusion that challenged everything you thought you knew about Italian food and American ingenuity. The hot dog slices floated in the sauce like tiny life preservers, maintaining their perfect circular shape with the determination of processed meat that refused to admit it didn't belong there. Each slice had that distinctive hot dog bounce, not quite meat, not quite rubber, but something engineered to survive both canning and childhood. The spaghetti itself had been cooked to within an inch of its life, achieving that perfect mushy texture that required no actual chewing. It would wrap around your fork like orange-tinted string, creating bites that were equal parts pasta, hot dog, and sauce that tasted like someone's vague memory of tomatoes.
I like those good and simple things, and that's why I like Spam.
Spam-like mystery meat loaf. Not quite Spam, not quite meat, but definitely something that came in a rectangular can and sliced into perfect squares with the precision of processed food engineering. It had the color of ham and the texture of firm Jell-O, with a flavor that suggested it had been designed by committee to offend as few taste buds as possible. When you opened the can, it would slide out in one perfect gelatinous block, maintaining its rectangular shape with the dignity of something that knew exactly what it was and wasn't ashamed of it. Slicing it required a sharp knife and steady hands, because one wrong move would turn your neat slices into a pile of pink crumbles. It fried up surprisingly well, developing crispy edges that almost made you forget about its suspicious origins. Served between 2 slices of white bread with mustard and maybe a pickle if the family budget allowed such luxuries, it made sandwiches that filled bellies and asked no uncomfortable questions about their own authenticity.
Sparkling crystals of dark, rich, pure coffee.
Wonder why they sparkle.
I don't know, but I'll have another cup.
Instant coffee in a giant tin. That massive metal container of freeze-dried coffee crystals sat in your pantry like a brown powder time bomb, promising caffeine delivery with all the flavor and sophistication of burnt cardboard soaked in regret. The crystals looked like tiny brown rocks, each one packed with enough bitter disappointment to wake the dead. Making it was simple. Add hot water and stir until the crystals dissolved into something that technically qualified as coffee, but tasted like someone had described coffee to someone who'd never actually had coffee. It was brown, it was caffeinated, and it was what passed for morning fuel when real coffee beans were beyond your family's grocery budget. The smell would fill your kitchen with the aroma of roasted disappointment, but it did the job. Your parents would drink cup after cup, grimacing slightly with each sip, but grateful for the caffeine that helped them face another day of making a dollar stretch until it screamed.
Fresh, juicy pieces of fruit, cut big and firm and chunky.
fruit cocktail in heavy syrup that can contain what someone optimistically called fruit, but what looked more like colorful chunks floating in sugar water thick enough to coat your teeth with sweetness. The fruit pieces had achieved that perfect canned texture, soft enough to require no chewing, but firm enough to maintain their mysterious geometric shapes. You'd get mostly pears and peaches, with the occasional grape that had somehow survived the canning process, and a rare maraschino cherry that served as the prize at the bottom of the can. The syrup was so thick it moved like honey, coating every piece of fruit in a sugary shell that made everything taste exactly the same. Canned potatoes. Those pale, soft spheres bobbing in their own juices looked like they'd given up on life before they ever made it to your plate. They had the texture of cooked soap and a flavor that suggested they'd been processed by people who'd heard about potatoes but never actually eaten one. The liquid they came in was mysteriously cloudy, like potato-flavored sadness that had been concentrated and canned for your convenience. When you drained them, they'd hold their shape with the determination of something that refused to admit it wasn't real food, but the moment you tried to mash or fry them, they'd fall apart into a paste that looked like wallpaper adhesive.
This is the #1 best-selling pot pie in America, and here's why. First, we start with our own savory gravy.
Frozen chicken pot pies, mostly crust. That aluminum tin promised a hearty meal of chicken and vegetables wrapped in flaky pastry, but what you got was approximately 3 tablespoons of filling surrounded by enough crust to feed a small army. The ratio was all wrong, like someone had designed it as a bread delivery system that happened to contain trace amounts of chicken. The filling was a mystery stew of what might have been chicken, definitely some peas, possibly a carrot or two, all swimming in gravy that had the consistency and flavor of flour paste. You'd dig through layers of crust, searching for actual protein like a prospector panning for gold. Hot dogs in jars. Those pale pink tubes floating in cloudy liquid looked like specimens in a mad scientist's laboratory. They were dinner when dinner needed to happen fast and cheap. The brine had a smell that was part pickle juice, part mystery, and entirely unappetizing until you got used to it. Opening the jar required commitment. Once you broke that seal, you were committed to eating hot dogs that had been marinating in their own juices for however long they'd been sitting on that shelf. They'd slide out of the jar with the enthusiasm of something that knew it wasn't quite food, but was trying its best anyway. The texture was different from fresh hot dogs, softer, more yielding, with a slight tang from the brine that actually wasn't terrible once you adjusted your expectations. They'd plump up when you boiled them, achieving something approaching normal hot dog consistency. But they were protein, they were shelf-stable, and they made meals when fresh meat was beyond the weekly grocery budget. Served with mustard on white bread or chopped up in mac and cheese, they fed families who understood that food was fuel first, and flavor was a luxury you hoped for but didn't count on. Peanut butter and banana sandwich spread, premixed. That jar contained someone's interpretation of Elvis's favorite sandwich, but in paste form that looked like baby food and smelled like artificial banana mixed with peanut butter that had given up on life. The color was somewhere between beige and yellow, creating a hue that didn't exist in nature and probably shouldn't have existed in jars either. The texture was the real challenge, smooth but somehow gritty, with chunks of something that might have been banana or might have been hope, all suspended in a peanut butter base that had lost its way. It spread like thick glue and tasted like someone had described both peanut butter and bananas to someone who'd never eaten either. But it made sandwiches when sandwich fillings were limited, and it provided protein and calories when both were precious commodities. Your mom would buy it because it was cheaper than buying peanut butter and bananas separately, even if the result bore only a passing resemblance to either ingredient. The strangest part was how it would grow on you. After a few sandwiches, your taste buds would surrender to the inevitable, and suddenly this artificial concoction would start tasting almost normal. That's when you knew your standards had officially adjusted to match your circumstances. Generic grape drink mix that never dissolved. That industrial-sized tub of purple powder promised grape-flavored refreshment, but delivered something that looked like it had been mixed in a paint factory and tasted like someone's vague memory of fruit. The powder was so fine it would puff up in clouds when you opened the container, coating your kitchen in purple dust that looked like evidence of a crime scene. No matter how much you stirred, there would always be gritty bits floating in your drink like purple sand. The powder would clump together in stubborn little nuggets that refused to dissolve, creating a beverage experience that was part drink, part chewing exercise. The flavor was aggressively artificial, not grape so much as purple, with a sweetness that made your teeth ache and a chemical aftertaste that lingered long after you'd finished drinking. But it was wet, it was sweet, and it made water exciting when excitement was hard to come by. That tub would last for months, providing purple-tinted refreshment for a family that understood that drinks came in two varieties, water and whatever you could afford to make water taste like something else. It was liquid joy at a price that made sense. Puffed rice cereal that dissolved on contact. Those tiny, air-filled grains looked like cereal, but had the structural integrity of soap bubbles. The moment milk made contact, they'd begin their rapid transformation from crunchy to soggy to completely dissolved, giving you approximately 30 seconds to consume your breakfast before it turned into rice-flavored milk. The flavor was basically nothing, like eating air that had been shaped into tiny, grain-like pellets and toasted just enough to give them a faint hint of something that might have once been rice. But they were cheap, they filled bowls, and they technically counted as breakfast when breakfast needed to happen on a budget. The real skill was speed eating, racing against time and physics to consume as many crunchy puffs as possible before they surrendered to the inevitable. You'd shovel spoonfuls into your mouth like you were competing in the world's saddest eating contest. But they were cereal, and cereal was breakfast, and breakfast was important even when it tasted like disappointment and dissolved before you could properly chew it. They kept you fed until lunch, which was really all any breakfast cereal needed to accomplish. Evaporated milk as cream substitute. That small can of concentrated milk promised richness and creaminess, but delivered something that tasted like milk that had been through a trauma and never quite recovered. It was thicker than regular milk, but thinner than cream, with a slightly metallic flavor that suggested it had been processed by machines that might have been used for other purposes. Your mom would use it in coffee, creating a pale brown mixture that was technically cafe au lait, but tasted more like coffee-flavored disappointment with delusions of grandeur. It would swirl through the coffee in pale ribbons, creating patterns that were prettier than the resulting flavor. But it was shelf-stable. It was cheaper than real cream, and it made coffee special when special was measured in tiny increments. A can would last for weeks, providing dairy enhancement for whatever beverages needed enhancing in a household where every grocery purchase required careful consideration. The strangest part was how it would change the texture of everything it touched, making coffee feel thicker, more substantial, even if the flavor was questionable. It was richness on a budget, luxury measured in tablespoons rather than cup. Hamburger helper. Without the hamburger, that box promised a complete meal if you just added hamburger, but when hamburger wasn't in the budget, you learned to make magic happen with just the powder packet and noodles. The seasoning would do its best to create the illusion of meat, but everyone knew you were eating what amounted to flavored pasta with delusions of grandeur. The powder would turn the water orange or brown, depending on which variety you'd chosen, creating a sauce that tasted like someone had described beef to someone who'd never actually eaten it. But it was filling, it was warm, and it made dinner happen when dinner needed to happen, regardless of whether you had all the required ingredients. You'd eat it knowing exactly what it was. Poverty disguised as convenience food, struggle dressed up as a family meal, but it filled bellies and provided provided comfort in the form of carbohydrates and hope, seasoned with whatever spices could make noodles taste like something more substantial. The real miracle was how it could make a family feel fed and satisfied, even when everyone knew they were basically eating seasoned pasta. Sometimes the illusion of a complete meal was enough, especially when the alternative was no meal at all. These weren't just grocery items. They were survival tools, wrapped in packaging that promised more than they could deliver, but somehow delivered exactly what families needed: sustenance, affordability, and the simple dignity of putting food on the table when putting food on the table was an accomplishment worth celebrating.